Welcome to day 2 of our symposium on multiple perspectives on multilingualism and intercultural communication. As many of you know, this is in celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication. So welcome. I'm Agnes He. I'm the director of the center. So today we have our fourth and the last presentation, and I would like to invite my colleague from the Department of Linguistics, Professor Joy Jensen, to introduce our speaker. Professor Jensen is a sociolinguist, and a few years ago, the center started a workshop series on language and social justice, and Professor Jensen, in collaboration with Chair of Linguistics Michael Newman, who cannot be here today because he's busy with other commitments. They are the ones who presented the inaugural workshop, which had created a great impact on campus and beyond. Professor Jensen is also the principal investigator of a research project on campus, which is titled Stony Brook Stories of Language and Life. And this is a project where we connect research with outreach, where we want to understand our own community in terms of language choices and language use. So with that, please, Professor Jensen.
We were joking with Dr. Hu yesterday about who is going to introduce her. We could have had a long chain of introductions, but if I could just ask everyone to applaud her and we are all here today because of her. So thank you, Agnes. So it is my great honor to introduce Michael Newman, who is professor and chair of the Linguistics and Communication Disorders at Queens College. His research focuses on the sociolinguistics of immigration in New York and Barcelona. He is the author of articles in Language, Variation and Change, Language and Society, Journal of Sociolinguistics, American Speech, and other journals, as well as 3 books, including his most recent one on New York City English, which is what we're going to hear about today. This book covers the history, current features, and social meanings of English as spoken in New York City. And right now, he is a co-principal investigator of the NSF-funded QB Corpus of New York City English, which is a time-aligned compilation of the speech of about 400?
Something like 400.
The first portion of which will be made available this fall. He is currently working on a project to use cluster analysis of 216 vowel systems from this corpus with COVID Paul Oduard, who he specifically wanted to mention, who I might mention is an undergraduate student deeply involved in sociolinguistic research now. So the clustering organizes participants' vowel systems by similarity and differences rather than by traditional demographic categories. In addition to his work on New York City English, Dr. Newman has published research on Spanish, second-person singular pronouns, and language attitudes towards Catalan and Spanish in Barcelona. All of you are in for a treat as we hear about the activity.
Thank you. Thank you. So what I'm going to, 2 clarifications, that's COVID with a K. And also, what I'm going to, this is multilingualism, but we're going to look at multilingualism in one language. In fact, one language in one city. So this is what we'll be talking about. The first is an introduction as to what variation in sociolinguistics is and what New York City English is. Then there are 4 historical phases, how New York City English emerged, then the independence, so to the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, and after World War II, really, when we start getting New York City English starts really interacting with current racial dynamics. and then what this means for the field of variation of sociolinguistics. So the first thing is New York City English. So these maps are 3 examples of what dialectologists have described as New York City English. Dialectologists being people who dedicate themselves to describing dialects. The first one, as you can see, is early 1940s, was just a word atlas, like what words are used. And what you can see here is that it's this small area around the city, probably running right through Stony Brook here. And this one here, though, is 2006. It's by a variation in sociolinguistics, the founder of the field, but in a sort of guise of a dialectologist, just collecting data on vowel systems. And again, we have the same, so the words and the vowels correspond basically to each other. This is an example of one of the vowels he looked at. So there's a system traditional which those of you who grew up, particularly on Long Island, might have, where you have different vowels in the words bath, bad, and ban than bat, bag, back, and bang. So this, the way I just said it, except maybe I gave you a particularly strong version because I'm performing. But some of you who grew up around here may have this system. And traditionally, this was the system that was used. Here you see another dialectological, sort of more an online one. And what we have here is that New York City English is combined with the Hudson Valley, which is a traditional connection. They're not exactly the same, as you can see here with 5 and 6, but that's the way it was. They've traditionally been connected. So variation of sociolinguistics is a field where variation is seen as inherent to language. That is, as opposed to assuming a norm where everybody says the same thing the same way. So we were, or we was, and we don't judge that in either case. But a variationist would say it's probably going to get we was sometimes and we were sometimes, and that's just inherent in all languages. That variation is connected to language change. So over time, maybe one form becomes more and more common until the other form disappears. And that variation is defined in terms of order, that there are rules that you can actually use to explain frequencies and which forms go together. It's not just chaos. It's not just random. And finally, how the heterogeneous, what we do in variation sociolinguistics is look at how the variation works, try to understand the social patterns, the linguistic patterns, and how it affects change. And we want to bring in multilingualism because he's not really a variationist. Salikoko Mufwene is a very important linguist, but he's really been connected to the field. And he talks about how language contact, that is, when you have people speaking multiple languages in the same area, and their bilingualism, multilingualism in general, that accelerates changes in the languages in contact. That's part of what he's, one of the contributions he's made. So variation of sociolinguistics is deeply connected to New York City because it was born by work by Bill Lubov in this book called Social Stratification of English in New York City, based on his dissertation at Columbia. Came out in 1966, so the work he was doing was in the early 1960s on the Lower East Side. That's a picture of the Lower East Side at the time behind there. And these are some of the findings that he had that are relevant to the theme here, which is talking about race and its influence on how New York City English developed. So he says, and we're going to start sort of in the middle of the story because of the history goes back to the colonial times, but let's start in the 1960s when variation of sociolinguistics began. And so he examined the black Lower East Siders, African American Lower East Siders, and white Lower East Siders. He decided, based on the initial findings, that the two systems that these people were using, even though they were neighbors, were too different to examine as one system. And that the white Lower East Siders had New York City English features, whereas the black Lower East Siders were speaking features that were not regional, but across the U.S., African American, what we now call African American language or African American English. At the time, they were calling it Black English, probably, or Black Vernacular English. But he decided that he couldn't examine both, and he was interested in New York City, so he examined really the white speakers. He concentrated on the white speakers of New York City English. And that there was an interesting finding, though, in terms of that, is that the white New Yorkers hated their language. They thought they spoke terrible English, but the blacks thought the white people were speaking great English. So there was another, weird divide going on there. And that the features, if you look here at this little chart here, I mean, I'm not really going to just sort of, you see how this pattern goes? So as A here is when people are speaking casually, D here is where they're speaking very consciously, they're reading word lists. And this is a New York City English features, which is dropping of the aw. Like, you got to pronounce your R's. I mean, I actually do pronounce my R's. But even though I grew up in Queens, I don't know why I pronounce my R's, but I have suspicions because I was just too nerdy. But my friends didn't mostly pronounce their R's, right? Now, this R-lessness is a New York City English feature, and when New Yorkers are speaking, casually, they don't pronounce it very much. All these lines are going in the same direction. Now, each of these lines is a different social class. So this line here with the 18% of their R's pronounced is about 18%. Those are the upper middle class. And then as you go down here in social classes, each of these lines is a different social class. You're getting less R's pronounced. So that the people that are really low, he calls them lower class. Today we'd say low income. They're hardly pronouncing any R's at all. And, but each of these groups, as they pay more attention to the speech, they're increasing their R's. That is, they're sounding less like New Yorkers. And this pattern happened with every single feature that was associated with New York City English. So the black New Yorkers, the African Americans in the Lower East Side, were two different. He didn't examine those. But then he went to Harlem with a group of sort of field workers, some of them African Americans, to do interviews with children. And he got involved with an education grant, and he did a report, which was never published, but you can see it. It's in like little libraries somewhere. It's huge. It's this thing report for the Educational Service, and he describes the features of what he's calling here Negro English. Of course, we wouldn't use that time today. And he talks about ghetto and all this sort of very out-of-date language. And he did publish, however, some work for public consumption. This one is the most famous, an essay called Non-Standard Logic of Non-Standard English, and in which he describes, he really attacks we call it today in education a deficit view, that the achievement gap that we see between the poorer African Americans and the other groups is to do with them. It's the problem with those people that are underachieving. He's attacking that view, and he sort of shows very systematically that it's not the idea was that these kids are verbally deprived, which is an idea which is very persistent, and it's very weird considering that this is the community which 10 to 15 years later would be inventing rap music, right? It doesn't pass the smell test, but it's still there. It's revived now in what's called word gap research. There's a word gap. These kids are not getting enough words. And it's like he tried to kill it in the 1960s back. But anyway, another finding, he's working with these kids, and another finding is that they had no contact with any white peers. There was such a degree of segregation in New York. New York's still segregated. Long Island is still segregated. But at that time, there was no contact at all, reported by these kids. And that he also found that the most systematic or orderly speech was found with the core members of the peer groups. And these kids were very alienated from school. These were at teenage. Some of them were gang members. And they had what he described as the most sort of orderly speech. And he had the other kids that were more peripheral tended to be using more features that might be associated with non-African American English. But again, these features are not New York City features. So let's summarize what we have here. He has a view of the white New Yorkers as different than the black New Yorkers, that the white New Yorkers are New York City English speakers, and he also has a social class, that their speech varies by social class, and it also varies by ethnicity. I didn't mention that, but not very much. There's like little differences between Jews and Italians. And these groups have what he called linguistic self-hatred. The African Americans were not New York City English speakers. They spoke a non-regional ethnolect, that is like a dialect, but associated with ethnicity instead of associated with place. And they liked New York City English features. And there was a huge, in other words, you could think of it as a great divide between the two groups linguistically. So, and you can actually hear his recordings from from Harlem. He has them on his website, Bill Lubov. He's 90s, but he still has a website. He's still well, not that active, but you can go listen to listen to these recordings, and they don't sound like African American New Yorkers today. They sound quite different. But let's go back to the beginning, or even before the beginning of New York City English. The people who were in the New York City area at the time of the European settlement are known as the Munsee. The name is listed up here, but in fact, from my readings, it tends to be extended, and these other smaller groups are really bands of Munsee. I think the term that the people use are bands. I don't think Manhattan is a band, but anyway, these were groups of Munsee. And they're still there, still around, but they're not very much into the city. They were ethnically cleansed out of their original homeland, and they're now scattered in various places. But we do have Unkachunk, we have Shinnecock, and we have Montauk, who are not Lenape. They're neighbors. So they were their neighbors, and they're still here on Long Island. But the linguistic, what we're talking about language here, so there's very limited contributions to New York City English. If anything, Manhattan, which is, according to Goddard, the Munsee term, the Munsee Lenape term for place for gathering wood for bows. Not hilly island, but place for, which is an etymology which is out there. But Goddard gives a good case that it's actually place for gathering wood for bows. And then there are other, these Lenape are Algonquin. There are Algonquin speakers. That's a huge language family across much of North America. And those Algonquin names in general are all over various features such as raccoon or caucus, actually, is an Algonquin word. But we can't ascribe it to any particular subfamily of Algonquin. Linguists in general don't really care much about lexical borrowings. People who are non-linguists tend to think, oh, lexical borrowings are sort of a big deal, but linguists don't really think they're very important. We're more interested in grammatical features and pronunciations and how languages influence each other in that way. So the Dutch, before New York City English also is the Dutch. The Dutch were the first Europeans to settle in the area. They were here until 1664, and then they briefly recaptured New York in 1673, and the English traded New York City for Suriname. Well, they changed it into whole New Netherlands. So that Suriname became a Dutch colony, and the English got New York back. But the first non-indigenous New Yorker, this is just an anecdote, was this guy called either Jan Rodriguez or Juan Rodriguez, and he was dropped off by a boat because he, according to the court testimony, he didn't want to get back on the ship. Maybe they didn't treat him too good. He was described in the data in the records as a free mulatto, so he could do what he wanted. But they left him with some stuff, and he came, and then he disappears from history, but it's just a great anecdote that the first non-indigenous New Yorker was a Dominican. And not white. The Dutch settled with Europeans and Africans, mostly but not all enslaved, and they traded and did work and did warfare and with the Lenape around them. The community was already multilingual, which of course is a source of complaint a lot of the time. And we see this term like 18. They were reporting. The Dutch governor actually said we have 18 languages here, which is kind of what just to follow on what Allison was talking about. The commodification and problematization was already there in the 17th century. Dutch, of course, was the lingua franca. In 1664 and again later, the English begin to arrive in numbers. There were English speakers before, but there were only a few of them. Now you get a large number. They could not attract many from Britain, from Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland. They couldn't really attract many, but they did come from other colonies. There were a number of New Englanders who couldn't stand being under the Puritans. So there's this conflictual relationship with New England which develops. And there was also migration out and in to Philadelphia, in from Philadelphia. The Dutch remained in New York, but they maintained a separate society. So it was like they didn't get along with the English leadership. There was even a rebellion led by a guy called Leisler, who was a German, but he led a mainly Dutch rebellion against the government. But the Dutch elite families, whose names are all over the place in New York City, they were perfectly happy with the English rule, and even Wyckoff, I can't remember, he was a Dutch guy, but he changed his name to Wyckoff, which doesn't sound particularly English, but anyway. He did, and all these names we have around are Dutch, named for Dutch families that owned particular areas. Because of this, it's kind of weird that New York has no Dutch influence in the language. There's no Dutch, besides like a few words like cruller and stoop. There's not really much, and those aren't words that are no longer specific to New York City English. There's no Dutch in pronunciation, and Dutch was maintained until the late 19th century. Apparently there were still church services, religious services in Dutch Reformed churches in Dutch until the late 19th century. And here we have a Dutch speaker. Anybody recognize her? Sojourner Truth, whose name I think anyone who goes to New York, to American schools should know. She was an advocate for abolition. She was born enslaved in the Hudson Valley, and she spoke Dutch as a child and had a Dutch accent in English all through her life. And this is bottom here. We have a very different social status. This is Theodore Roosevelt's grandfather, who was also brought up speaking Dutch, according to Teddy Roosevelt. So President Roosevelt's grandfather was a Dutch speaker. There's no influence from Dutch, but New Netherlands corresponds to today's New York City English and the Hudson Valley. You can see this. So the Hudson Valley English is spoken on the west side of this line. On the east side is Connecticut. On the west side is New York State. And that's the border of New Netherlands. Here we have the last Dutch name in American Dutch. Kil meant stream. It meant something else in Holland, in the Netherlands. And the last westernmost stream is Tremperkel. And Tremperkel is on the right side. It's in the Catskill Mountains, Andes, New York. They speak very differently than in Delhi, which is like 5-10 miles away on the other side. In Delhi, they have features which, like they say, camp and back and have that are spoken all the way to Chicago and beyond to some parts of Wisconsin. But that doesn't happen in Andes. So that's the Hudson Valley line. And on Long Island, we see the same thing, where we saw the same thing where I don't even want to try to pronounce this Dutch name, but what's now Hempstead. was the last Dutch town, and that corresponds to the Nassau-Suffolk border. Of course, now we have New York City English speakers here, but that's really from post-World War II with the movement of people from Nassau County and the city to Suffolk County to this area. So there's a lot of New York City English here, but almost everybody here who speaks New York City English, their grandparents or their, at least go back to they'll have origins in Brooklyn or Queens or Nassau. So, summary. Colonial New York City English developed entirely from the English of British settlers. No Dutch, no Lenape. And this is a pattern which is characteristic of New York City, of North American English in general. New York American English begins as a white variety. And it's the same in France, right? The French in Quebec, right? It's mostly in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. It comes from the European settlers. That's the origin of the language. It's entirely separate from the other groups which do not contribute to those white varieties, which is a big contrast. I mean, obviously we have African American English beginning with the 1619, right? But that doesn't influence the white varieties until much later. The contrast here is with Latin America. Like, this seems natural to us. Of course it comes from the European settlers. But in Mexico City, the Mexico City dialect of Spanish has indigenous features, and that's true in general in Mexico. Caribbean Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese are African, have a lot of African, what we call substrate. That is, they've been influenced by African languages. And we have, continuing today, we have indigenous lingua francas, for example, in Paraguay. Today, most Paraguayans will speak an indigenous language, Guarani. And in South America, until the 19th century, there was a dominant Tupi language spoken, for example, in São Paulo called Língua Geral. And African Creoles are even more African influenced. So the Atlantic Creoles are African influenced European languages mixed together. So they're African and with African grammar and European words. That includes Jamaican Creole, what Jamaicans call Pidgin, includes Haitian Creole, includes and some other languages spoken in the Caribbean area and in Africa also. Large-scale immigration begins after independence. There's already people from different countries, but we have huge influx of Germans in the 1830s. Germans are actually about half the population of New York, can trace their ancestry to Germany in this pre-Civil War area. And we have this Klein Deutschland on the Lower East Side. In 1840s, we get Irish immigration and smaller numbers of Italians, Poles, and a few other people. The documentation that we have in New York City English, though, shows no influence from any of these. This is from a diary from a farmer, a Brooklyn farmer called John Baxter. It's the earliest I've found. And if you look at what he's writing here, the wind, northeast, snowing, I a gunning had 7 birds. So you have this gunning. So we think of like a walking and a talking, and we think of that as the speech like of West Virginia, of Kentucky. But in New York City English at the time, in the 19th century, that was common here. We see another attestation. This is from Horatio Alger, who is a novelist, a children's novelist. He wrote about street kids in New York. He knew those street kids very well. So we had to be always suspicious when we have a fictional depiction of language. We don't know what's literary. We don't know how well the author really depicted dialogue and some of them do it well, some of them didn't. We've got to be a little suspicious, but sometimes we see features that we still see today. So, or if we see in other sources. So he fit so hard instead of he fought so hard. And he died, he told his widow, instead of widow, and it's spelled with an ER. It's not widder, it's widow. And we know that means to us that the language was, we were already dropping our R's in New York. We see some R dropping here also in his diaries, in Baxter's diaries. So we could assume that, that the R dropping was really quite early in New York City English. We also see a representation of African American English. So it's, I'm sure you can't read it, but it's it's mock African American English. That is not real African American English. They're making fun of it. These people speak so funny, you know. They say "what am dat" instead of what is that. But we also know that the am is unlikely to, that doesn't make any sense. If anything, the person would say what that or what is that, not what am dat. But we see this W here, it's spelled, what is spelled W-A-T. So that means that they weren't saying what, which is what we see today. So we think that's probably accurate, right? Because that corresponds to what people say today. Not just African Americans, but most Americans. But at the time, more Americans said, distinguished which from which, right? Which with a W-H and which to the person on the broom. And dat. So that we also see today, right? We see that today in African American speech, but also in other people's speech. It's not that uncommon. So we assume that that's probably accurate. But what's really important here is that there's a sense that African Americans don't speak the same as we do, right? The person who's writing this. And that they can make fun of it is another. But not surprising, right? They're making fun of it because they're racists. But there's an awareness of the difference, which is something valuable when we think about the history. So what we're seeing here in terms of language contact is none. There's no language contact in New York City English. It's just purely the development of the English settlers with a few words from Lenape and a few words from Dutch. But and there's also a sense of multidialectalism in the city, that there's different people speaking in different ways. So what happens now after, so we have independence, we have the Civil War, and we have an increase of, and we had immigration before that, now we have more immigration. We have more Irish people coming in because of the potato famine in Ireland, and then Italians. There's a lot of conflict in Italy, there's a lot of poverty, so Italians come, and there's a lot of persecution in Eastern Europe, so Eastern European Jews as opposed to only German Jews arrived first with the other Germans. Eastern European Jews were basically Russian Empire. That's my great-grandparents arrived. And we have these inter-ethnic conflicts and alliances developing. Meyer Lansky met Lucky Luciano on the Lower East Side. That's an alliance which led to the development of Murder Incorporated. Don't believe that the organized crime was an Italian thing only, right? It was, my people were there too. I got a lot of credit when I was teaching high school with that connection because my cousin knew Meyer Lansky, worked with Meyer Lansky. That's the side of the family that I only heard about late. When we look at the language features here, we now see language contact appearing. We see what we're calling, this is the technical term, DH-TH fortition. That's the this becomes dis, that becomes dat. That's the DH part, and then the TH part is like 3 becomes tree, thick becomes thick, I have to say that properly, not thick, not tick, but thick. And so it's that 3, right? Tree, tick, thoughts. That would be an influence that comes in from maybe from Italian, maybe from German, probably both, also from Irish. Maybe also starting to get some African Americans influencing the white variety. We can't say where something comes from. That was Salikoko Mufwene's, one of his contributions is that it doesn't matter. The form is what's important, not the origin. We have y's Anybody here say yuz? Sometimes. So that comes from Irish. It's found all over Irish diaspora. It's found in Scotland. It's found in Australia. You can hear yuz, probably less yuz guys, but we see that in this book here by Stephen Crane, who's an important literary author, and he says, "Yuz kids makes me tired." I don't know if the makes was accurate, but the yuz definitely. What the hell? So that's what the hell, defighting. So those developments start appearing. He's depicting Irish American, poor Irish Americans in this book called Maggie, Girl of the Streets. This is sort of this Lower East Side classic scene of immigrants. These are an Italian family. So we get this kind of, these features. But for linguists who are looking at like language and sort of like more geeky and wonky, we notice that it's noticeable that the consonants were getting these influences from these other languages. So Long Island instead of Long Island, that's a feature which you also see in singer becomes singer. So singer rhymes with finger, right? That comes from Yiddish. Yuz coming from Irish. This D tree for this fortition, this DHTH fortition. We have like instead of 3 P's, instead of P's, peace. So P's, P-A-S, rhyme is the same as P-E-A-C-E. We have intonation patterns that we can trace to these immigrant languages, and New York City English becomes all these, starts to incorporate all these features, but the vowel system is not at all. The vowel system is entirely based on the settlers. So if we take this stereotype phrase, toid, toid, and soid, we have the toid from this vowel, the non-rhotic nurse is called the noise vowel. That comes from English, from originally spoken, and you can hear that in Theodore Roosevelt's speeches. Theodore Roosevelt used that vowel. It was not stigmatized at the time. But what happens is that as the time goes on, more and more anti-immigrant sentiment. Everything you're hearing today about the immigrants, including the dogs and the cats, was said about the immigrants then. Everything. And the poisoning of the blood, saying the same thing. And this was a book by Madison Grant, who's one of the founders of the Bronx Zoo. And he was a eugenicist and a racist. And he started this idea that it's not enough to be white, you got to be the really, really white. And the really not that white were Italians and Jews and Irish. We were not white enough. So it was a partial racialization. And the xenophobia wasn't, before xenophobia in the US would have been about religion mostly. We can't have these Catholics. Now we can't have these racially inferior people ruining the race of the Nordics, which were the Germans and the English, and the Scots were sort of honorary Germanic, whatever. Racists are not usually very, I mean, they come up with their conclusions based on their needs to come up with those conclusions. So what happens is, at the beginning, New York City English is fine. Nobody hated New York City English. They hated the immigrant version of New York City English. But the whole thing with this idea of New York becoming this racist, this racially impure place, New York City English itself is described as not American enough, not white enough, and New York City English becomes stigmatized. This is the work, some research by Tom Bonfiglio. It's kind of weird that in the United States, the prestigious form of the language is from the country, not from the city. In Paris is the model of French. London is the model of English. In Scotland, Edinburgh is the model of English, right? But in the US, the model of English is somewhere vaguely out west. This led in 1924 to the cutoff of immigration. So no more immigrants arrive, and when Bill Lubov, well, we'll get here. So this is the summary of the ideas that we have. We have increasing numbers of immigrants, particularly in a change. They're in Irish and Italians, European Jews. The Germans had no influence on New York City English, but now we have racialization, and we have these effects, this language contact where Italian, Irish, and Yiddish are starting to affect what we see of as New York City English. There's a cutoff of immigration, and New York City English becomes stigmatized. And New York City speakers, speakers of New York City English become victims of internalize this stigma and begin to think that they speak badly. So in 1960s, when Bill Lubov did his research, that was the situation. But we have a change before that time. So immigration cutoff is to maintain the purity of the United States, and particularly New York, and it backfires. Because, well, at least as far as New York goes, because there's now a need for workers. That doesn't go away. And there's a system of Jim Crow in the South. So those are called push factors. What gets people to move are push factors. What attracts them are pull factors. We have the pull factors in the jobs, maybe not that well paid, but we have the jobs. And we have the push factor, which is the more extreme racism in the South. So African Americans moved north, not just to New York, of course. And then after African Americans, while they're still arriving, we have the Puerto Rican Gran Migración. So Puerto Ricans are also being pushed out by American colonial policies, those are push factors, ruining agriculture in Puerto Rico, and the pull factors of the need. And they actually send recruiters to the island to bring in Puerto Ricans, and Puerto Ricans are US citizens, so they're able to come. And this takes place until about 1960s. Now, there were always Spanish speakers in New York. Remember, the first non-Egyptian New Yorker was a Dominican guy. Well, there was no Dominican Republic, but anyway. And there were Africans, free and enslaved Africans in New York from the beginning, but there were very few. There was a few communities. There were free African Americans. Weeksville in Brooklyn, which is near Bedford-Stuyvesant, was an African American community. At the time, Seneca Village, which is where Central Park is, was an African American area. But the huge numbers, most African Americans will trace their ancestry to New Yorkers will trace their ancestry to this Great Migration. When Bill Lubov did his research, African Americans were he found second generation African Americans, and he found Puerto Ricans that were first generations, but they couldn't be interviewed because they were not really speakers of New York City English. African Americans were. I want to watch the time here. I'm running out of time. So you have the consequences of internal migration. We have segregation, we have some intermingling of African Americans, and we have research now taking place after Bulov. Some three sociolinguists began to work with Puerto Ricans. And we find that the Puerto Ricans, young Puerto Ricans, have Spanish features in their English. So we find some Spanish features, we find interest. The actual interest was in how they were adopting African American features, but the researchers all found actual Spanish features in their English. They found some features such as, I won't go into it for time, but there were influences of Spanish, particularly the rates at which people would say walked. They would say more walk than, like she walked yesterday. Things like that we found later. Puerto Ricans also break the racial binary. Puerto Ricans didn't consider themselves whites. They didn't consider themselves blacks. Their actual physical appearance, for the most part, I'm generalizing, but for the most part, they didn't see themselves as belonging to either of these groups, whatever their physical appearance was. And that broke essentially a crack at the time, and later with greater immigration, broke the racial binary in New York. So race in New York is beginning to break down as just two groups. In 1965, there was an Immigration Act signed, where we really opened up immigration. This is Lyndon Johnson, the mayor of New York here, Hubert, the vice president. The only non-white person here is the senator from Hawaii, whose name I don't remember, and Robert Kennedy, who's the senator from New York, Robert Kennedy Sr. And this creates the city we see today. 60% of New York, of the city, and probably Long Island, not that much different, trace themselves to be 2 generations or less from immigration. There is no racial majority, and there's extraordinarily complex racialization in the sense that people's categories are not straightforward, and there's a lot of people that are mixing and identifying themselves as not belonging to any single group. There's been a lot of research by sociolinguists that has taken place since about 2000, including my own. And what we've tended to do is take the categories that existed prior and just add the new categories to them. We're not really accepting the complexification of the racial. We're trying to look at what had happened before. And one schema that we see in this research, in my research and other sociolinguist research, is this type of schema. It's also found in sociology. It's a really interesting book by Kazinets et al. Called Inheriting the City on Second Generation, is that we have one group of races at the top. These are treated as races. Middle Eastern, North Africans treated together. And then we have ethnicities. So for example, all of us, I put other people that I'm included in here, is that we break these down into sort of national heritages, Jews, Italians, right, West Indians. So we see this as a sort of a pattern in which we can look at things. And this is 2 examples of quantitative research. This is an article which I participated in, and you can see here that we have the 4 races, and we see them behaving on average and significantly differently. So in case we have, this is the ban. So we have more ban here, and this is more like ban here. So these are the blacks and the whites, and these are the Asians and Latinx. And we see a difference here where the whites say bag, but nobody else says, more so like bag. Bag. So we see these differences, and we see significant differences. This is over time. This is from Kara Becker's work on the vowel in aw. So this is aw, very New York, and this is aw, very not New York. And we see that by time, as they're older, older New Yorkers with more aw, they're white, and more like white go down here, more like aw. So if you're more white New Yorkers will do this by aw. But African Americans are moving in a different direction. Other groups are following the white group here, at least the Latinx and Asians. But African Americans are moving in a different direction. So this research is insightful in a sense that we get group differences on average. However, we also see another difference happening, which is that New York City English loses its stigma. No young New Yorker seems to think there's anything wrong with New York City English. At least, any young people who think there's something wrong with New York City English? Good. We see these kinds of YouTubes. This is a contest. Who won the best New York City English contest? We see these 2. He's part Dominican, part Puerto Rican. She's African diaspora. I don't know what her background is exactly. And they're giving a thing about how to talk like a New Yorker. Actually, it's really just how to talk like an African American, because a lot of the features are general for African American English. They're all about words. They just think it's words. And this is like how to talk like New Yorker, like New York. So summary, we get African Americans, then we get Puerto Ricans, then we get everybody. We get, at the same time, the New York City English features that were traditionally white New York City English features. Remember, New York City was a white dialect, starts to decline. New York City English loses its stigma, and we get complex racialization. That is, it's harder to understand what's going on with race. Now, New York variations get accused of being essentialists. But in fact, this is, as you could see, there's these patterns that are not really easily explained unless you're doing these groups, right? These groups. And we're saying these groups behave in certain ways. And we see this in the data, but there's always been, this is from Bernard Aubou and Tiberge, there's always been this pushback within the field of variation of sociolinguistics that what does this really mean? Is this really useful to understand? I mean, we have to explain something, but how are these categories? And it's not just race. It's like age, it's gender, it's even geography. I mean, what is this telling us? And we've been skeptical. And we have these other linguists that have also expressed these skepticism about what these categories really mean. And there's these problems. Essentialization is one problem. What are these? Who are these categories? Under theorization. What does this mean to be a race? What is a race? What does it explain? So there's these problems with these categories. And African American and race is really problematic because it's evil. I mean, the only purpose race ever had was to differentiate people, to treat people that you're different from badly. I mean, that's why it exists. There's no biological going on there. So it's a problematic category. And since I'm late here, I'm going to skip through this. But it just, these are issues that have been plaguing race in general, and this has been shown in a lot of work by Charity Hudley, Mallinson, and Buchholz have been the ones leading the lead. But still, these categories are not just theoretical categories in the sense that New Yorkers, they exist in the imaginary of all Americans. When I asked Queens College students, what are the races in New York? This is the answer I got. And we can see both the existence of these categories as in people's imaginary, and we can see how they're ill-defined. They're bad categories, ways to categorize, because they're ill-defined. People have a sense that there's a black race, there's a white race, there's a Latino race, or a Latinx race. That's a belief that's out there and pretty well established by most of the people that I've asked. But the Asian is kind of problematic as a category because it's not clear whether they meant East Asian, because I didn't ask them I didn't give them an answer. I just they would say, what are the races? And then they might write Asian, or they might write East Asian, or they might write Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc. It's not clear if they meant Asian, just East Asian, or South Asian included, or South Asian was a part, because about half the people that wrote Asian also wrote South Asian as a separate category. So if they wrote that, then that's East Asian is separate. So the category is not well defined. And then you have a smattering of other ones. This was a census year, which is probably why we got these two categories, because there are not many of them in New York. And then other people, like Italians, might say, Italian, and Jews might say, we're a race too. So we tended to get these groups, but you have these four essentialist categories, and this one's kind of in there too. And New Yorkers are able to distinguish at above average rates, above expected rates, 4 different racial groups at least. This is from some research which I did with Angela Wu. So you can see that when we played these voices, we had 8 men, 8 women, and they were able to differentiate them. Even when they had a minority, most people got it wrong. This is, she's a Chinese 1. FC1 is Chinese 1. So most people got her as black, but pegged her as black. But more people pegged her as Asian than any of the non-Asians. So there's something going on with voices that people are able to, whether they categorize it or not, they're able to categorize. Finally, we have this research which I'm doing with the CUNY corpus of New York City English, and we're looking for volunteers to help us. Anybody wants to help work on the corpus, email me. We're breaking down vowel systems by how similar they are. So if you're next to each other here, you're really similar. Each is a speaker. Each is a New Yorker speaking, and we've broken them down here by age. This is my work with COVID. By age, and then by self-identified racial group. And you can see that none of these big groups, so these are the ones that are like top line similar, vaguely similar, none of these groups is any particular race, right? They're all mixed up because you see all mix of colors here. Each one has a mix of colors. These one we could say is mostly older. That's all we can say. But even there. But if you look more closely, group 2.1 is mostly older, but some people are young. And we still have a lot of mixture going on here. But if we look here, we see that some groups are pretty homogeneous and really similar people. So they're mostly similar to these people here that are not from different groups, but they're really like just small groups of people are mostly like these ones are all white except for 2 blacks. And these ones are all Latinx except for a couple of black ones and mixed. So we see these groupings that are very specific but very low level. I'm going to skip here, just go to the end. Conclusions. Variation of sociolinguistics developed at a time when it was possible to say that there were white English and black English in New York. That's not true anymore. We don't have any evidence for that. Although we believe as New Yorkers that there's a way of speaking associated with different racialized groups, we cannot say that that's an accurate depiction of what's going on. So what variationists need to do now is to take a step back. And as Allison said yesterday, we're somewhat lost, but we now need to step back and find our way and how to deal with this kind of data that we're finding. Okay, and those references, and I forgot to put on a, well, this is going to be sent off, but if anyone's interested, my email is easily found. Just Google my name, Queens College.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newman. I meant to take your microphone away, but
Oh, you can take it.
we're going to be answering more questions, I'm hoping. So there is so much to say about this rich and fascinating work. And first, I think when I think of sociolinguistics, language is us. This is how we project our identity, how we connect to others or recognize others. And what's so fascinating about what you were telling us is that we are looking at the history of the United States as we are looking at New York City English. And of course, New York is the center of the world. Everyone knew that all along. So all of those things are important, fascinating, meaningful. As I was thinking about what I hoped you would also tell us, of course, I think your audience would be really fascinated about your critique of people pretending to be New Yorkers in television shows and the movies. Oh. So if you want to share some of your wisdom there, I think people would like to hear that. But let me also ask you to comment on a more serious question. That I think what's fascinating about where the field of sociolinguistics could be going is looking at our understanding of the linguistic choices we make, choosing options, indexing particular social values that are associated with those linguistic features. And I think the corollary to that we don't always reflect on is we are all sociolinguists. We have to be able to make those connections, to project identity in that way. So I think there are a handful of my students here. I ask when I teach sociolinguistics, I ask whether a class on sociolinguistics ought to be required for citizens of a democracy. And I do believe that, because understanding who we are and how we use language would hopefully enable us to understand the relationships that we are putting people in. So I invite everyone's questions, but I'm asking you to tell us about language and power, if you like, or to tell us about the crimes of Marlon Brando. That's also.
In general, actors in America don't do a good job with accents. I will make a few honorable exceptions for, I can't remember, he's a New Yorker, Lucas Hedges. He's a New Yorker, and he did a Boston accent perfectly. It's really hard to do a Boston accent, if you're a New Yorker particularly, because the differences are just, like, you think maybe it's the same. Like, everyone thinks you say Boston no, it's not. No one in Boston says Boston. It's Boston. But it's like a park your car in Harvard Yard is pack your car, right? But we would say park your car in Harvard Yard in New York. So it's kind of really hard to do, and he did it. But bad actors we have for New York, Marlon Brando, who got everything wrong except the R-lessness. We have Tobey Maguire, who should be. He plays these regional people. He played, Spider-Man, who's Peter Parker, who grew up in Queens. Sounded like he was from SoCal. He played this orphan in Maine. Sounded like he was SoCal. He played a Pittsburgher. What did he sound like? SoCal. So terrible. But then you get Australians that come in and do it perfectly, and Brits, and they can do it perfectly. So I don't know. Maybe others. Marlon Brando is a disaster. No, yeah, didn't. Yeah. Oh, another one. Dennis Franz played a cop, New York City cop. Sounded like he was from Chicago. I mean, why didn't they build that into the story? Like, I moved from Chicago, was in love with him. No. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a very naive question. So I've been thinking, when we say this is New York English or Long Island English, we probably were thinking about we're connecting a kind of speech with a particular space.
Yeah.
The assumption being people don't move around that much, right? If you're here, you're here. This is what people here sound like. But with much greater mobility in recent years, and also I think with much greater tolerance for differences in how you sound. Is it true? I don't do research in the area. Is it possible that now and looking forward, we're not going to hear something like New York English anymore? There's not going to be a thing called New York English, because New York is a place where everybody comes, and then I don't bother to sound like my neighbor, right?
Well, the strong features are still are declining. So the thought, we saw that, the thought vowel. My nephew and nieces do not have a distinguished thought vowel. They mix it with, so they'll say caught and cot is the same, and you hear that more and more. But you do still hear some young people, and there's a social class difference there also. I think what happens is that you acquire these things very young, but you acquire them with people you identify with. So if you identify yourself as like, oh, this person's like me, that's what'll make you sound like that person. And if you're giving a huge amount of in-migration, or this is what I want to sound like, right? Also as a child. So a child doesn't think their parents are a model because they think their friends are a model. Because their model is them. They're not like their parents, they're like their friends. So you're going to get, to the extent that you had a huge influx of new Americans in comparable to what we have now in the pre-1924 period, but everyone ended up sounding like a New Yorker with their vowel systems. And now we have just a big an influx, and that's not happening. So they're not picking up the New York City vowel system anymore, necessarily. And I don't really know why, but I suspect it has to do with the more complex racialization that's going on, because at that time there was an aspiration to be white. And you had your teachers were Irish, generally Irish Americans. The Jews and Italians had Irish American teachers. Those would have been the models, original models for the first ones. And now it's much more complex, so who knows. But New Yorkers today's New Yorkers don't sound like Californians, right? Even the ones, right? You guys don't sound like you're from Canada or from the South. So.
You can still be made fun of if you go somewhere else.
Well, it made fun of, but look, if you look at the political situation now, there was comments that Mario Cuomo, when he was considered running for president, couldn't win because he had a New York accent. And now look at the situation. It's different.
Fascinating presentation. I was kind of intrigued by the book that mentioned Inheriting the City. I really love that book as well. One thing I noticed that in the book describing different ethnic groups, the youth, how their attitude towards their heritage language. One thing particularly about the Asians, whoever referring to, they are not really. They're the group that losing their heritage language most, and of course they achieved highest in English. So this. So what's your take as New York, seeing this kind of very divergent patterns towards English and whatever New York English and their home heritage languages?
That's a fascinating question. Of course, there's a lot of variation within the communities. A lot of the East Asian groups will have Saturday schools. So, but I think there's this monolingual idea also where you have this sense that if I'm going to speak Mandarin, then my English will be worse. And that belief system is pretty widespread. So I think there's a contradictory impulse and the fear of the child not succeeding, and that's very widespread in all these communities. There's less attachment to the language of origin in some communities than in others. So Russians, for example, tend to be really dismissive of Russian, but Bukharians, who are bilingual speakers, come as bilingual speakers of Russian and Bukharian, which is a Jewish language from Uzbekistan, will end up speaking Russian. So it's kind of as a second language. Russian is, so even the Russians are abandoning it, the Bukharians are adopting it as their second language. And then that's, of course, wide generalization, but that's a very coherent community in Regal Park, Queens. So and of course, I think the religious aspect is also when you have a religious connection to the language, which can happen particularly with Yiddish, obviously. The Yiddish is growing because they have a lot of children and they need to speak Yiddish that's another factor. There's a lot of research on that. And I think also with Spanish language churches and Haitian churches also, yeah.
You talked about the dropping of the R, which is the dropping of the R at the end,
I can't, sorry. I need to get a hearing aid.
R drop.
Oh, the R dropping? Yeah. So this is R dropping and R adding are connected. If you say law, L-A-W, and L-A-O-R-E, lore, as the same, you don't have a sound there. But you're going to say law. You're not going to say law and order. You're going to say law in order. And that's where that R, additional R, comes from. But what was really interesting I didn't talk about this, but what Leboeuf found was that in Haarlem, the kids that he interviewed in Haarlem didn't do that. They didn't say lore in order. They didn't say lore and legends. They would say law and legends. So they didn't have that idea. They didn't have that. And that was what was really interesting for a linguist about that is that's a subtle distinction which people are not likely to be able to notice. But it shows that there's a systemic difference between the ways of speaking despite the superficial similarity of both groups having R dropping. But all R dropping dialects except for African American English do that. You can hear that in London. Yeah.
I think this is a fascinating area where it would be nice to combine psycholinguistic perspectives and sociolinguistic perspectives more often than we do. So yesterday I was talking about, the role of priming and alignment in dialogue, right? which is a well-attested phenomenon, well-studied in psycholinguistics. So people tend to align to each other. But I wonder whether, the role of negative attitudes or positive attitudes is, and whether, having negative attitudes, so I don't want to sound like you, I really don't like that accent, but, if I'm in contact with people who sound like that, does that block automatic alignment and priming?
Well, there's a hypothesis to test, but I would also want to test it with just non-affective differences. So someone who's just like different from you, but not like a parent. I mean, that's we see that with the parents, right? The children love their parents, but they don't want to talk like them. So if we could find some other way I would love to see that happen.
For example,
Yeah.
people the same age, same generation, to what extent automatic natural priming and alignment works in these phenomena.
Right.
I work on grammar, syntax, lexicon, and non-linguistic phenomena, but I really think that it's a great research area that should be.
Yeah, I agree. Totally. Let's write an NSF and European grant together. Well, UK grant, no longer, unfortunately, European. How about one of the undergraduates here? I don't think we can leave until at least one of you guys has to. Yes. Speak. You have to scream. I can come up. Yeah, that'd be great.
When it comes to English in New York City versus English in Long Island, I was wondering if there are like differences between the two.
Okay, so the dialect origins of it seems that originally it was Western Long Island was the same as New York, but what happened was because of the movement out from the city into Suffolk, that it was different. But the Suffolk was settled, Suffolk County in general was settled from Connecticut, not from the city originally. So if you go way out East End, they speak very differently than, you could still hear the old. You talk to some older people. There's actually recordings. If you look at there's some oral histories of this area here, and they sound like they're from the East End. So it's a different. It's a Western New England dialect in origin, but now, where are you going to get the best New York accent? It's going to be in Port Jeff. Just listen to some of the secretaries at Stony Brook.
So will you join me in thanking Dr. Newman again for